Look at this river. It seems peaceful now, but the Rio Grande sparked one of history's strangest border disputes. A conflict that literally changed which country thousands of people lived in overnight. When this river suddenly changed course in 1864, it created a 100-year diplomatic standoff, turned Mexican citizens into Americans without their consent, and eventually led to the destruction of entire neighborhoods. This isn't just about a line on a map, it's about how a small landscape change altered the course of history and shows what happens when nations put politics above people. Imagine waking up one morning to discover you're suddenly living in a different country. No moving trucks, no passports, just a river that decided to change course. This isn't science fiction. This actually happened. The Mexican-American War, to put it mildly, was devastating to Mexico. Beyond the 25,000 lives lost to disease and combat, Mexico forfeited over 500,000 square miles to the United States, modern-day California, Nevada, Utah, New Mexico, Colorado, Arizona, and parts of Oklahoma, Kansas, and Wyoming. In one stroke, Mexico lost half its territory. The compensation? A mere $15 million, a pittance for that much land, even in 1848. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo established the new U.S. Mexico border along the Rio Grande's middle or deepest channel. This river starts in the Rocky Mountains and runs 1,900 miles before emptying into the Gulf of Mexico. However, using a river as an international border created an inherent problem. Rivers move. Fluctuating water volumes constantly eroded riverbanks, shifting the channel. Early on, surveyors from both countries worked together to map the river, declaring which islands belonged to which nation. Islands north of the channel went to the U.S., while southern ones fell under Mexican jurisdiction. This temporary solution merely delayed a serious crisis. The river continued to shift naturally, but in 1864, something dramatic happened that would set the stage for a century of conflict. In 1864, a massive flood dramatically altered the Rio Grande's channel. As a result, a tract of land between El Paso, Texas and Ciudad Juarez, Mexico became the center of a century-long dispute. They called it El Chamizal, and even its size is contested. El Chamizal was officially measured at around 600 acres, though some sources like historian Leon Metz suggested the surrounding area was closer to 1,200 acres. Regardless of its exact dimensions, El Chamizal found itself caught between two nations after the river's major shift. This wasn't just empty land. El Chamizal was home to an entire community of Mexicans who suddenly found themselves on the American side of the border. People who woke up in a different country, subject to different laws, without ever moving an inch. One of these residents was farmer Pedro Ignacio Garcia del Barrio, whose family had owned land in El Chamizal since 1827. He quickly recognized the potential problems this border shift would create for property owners like himself. In 1866, Del Barrio and other property owners met with Mexican President Benito Juarez to express their concerns. The meeting prompted a letter of concern sent to the U.S. government. When that letter went unanswered, Mexico drafted two treaties in 1874 and 1875, attempting to resolve the situation. The U.S. ignored these as well, continuing a pattern that would define this dispute for decades to come, Mexico seeking resolution and the U.S. looking the other way. By 1884, the situation had grown far more tense. Another disputed area, the island of Mortoritos near Roma, Texas, was facing similar problems. The issue became so severe that U.S. officials from Roma occupied the island, prompting Mexico to call it an invasion. Mexico believed the island was part of Tamaulipas state, while the U.S. claimed the Mexicans were simply misreading maps and confusing it with a different island. Ironically, the United States never settled the island, and all the residents were culturally Mexican. Yet Mexico eventually agreed to give the island to the U.S. in exchange for a formal treaty addressing the river's shifting course. This resulted in the Treaty of 1884, which established a critical rule that would shape the conflict for decades to come: the law of accretion. According to this law, if a river changes gradually over time due to natural sediment deposits, accretion, the border moves with the river. However, if the river changes suddenly due to a severe event like a flood, the old channel remains the boundary. The seemingly simple rule would prove profoundly complex in practice, dragging out the El Chamisal dispute for another 80 years and causing untold hardship for those caught in the middle. While diplomats debated legal principles, real people suffered the consequences. Our friend Pedro Ignacio Garcia del Barrio's troubles were just beginning. In 1881, the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad began building through del Barrio's property despite his protests. His Mexican land claims meant little on what was now considered American soil. This led to the formation of the International Boundary Commission, IBC, in 1895. They accepted del Barrio's case, designated Chamisal Case No. 4, to determine whether the river's course changed rapidly, favoring Mexico, or gradually, favoring the United States. Despite countless testimonies from eyewitnesses, Commissioners Anson Mills and Javier Osorno only agreed that the change happened in 1864. They tabled the case, leaving Del Barrio helpless as construction continued. Del Barrio died in 1911 without seeing justice, but his son, grandson, and even great-grandson continued fighting for their ancestral land across 4 generations. By 1910, it had become obvious that the U.S. and Mexico would never resolve the El Chamisal dispute on their own. The two nations agreed to arbitration, with a Canadian legal expert, Eugene Lafleur, serving as a neutral third-party arbitrator. After hearing both sides, which had remained largely unchanged since the debate began, the Trinational Arbitration Tribunal issued a ruling on June 10, 1911. They proposed that land between the original riverbed and the middle of the river, after shifting, would go to the United States, while the rest would return to Mexican territory. Mexico was willing to accept this compromise. The United States was not. American IBC Commissioner Anson Mills claimed that the ruling violated the terms of arbitration and refused to accept it. The Mexicans saw this refusal as proof that Americans wouldn't agree to anything that wasn't entirely in their favor. This failed arbitration represented yet another setback in resolving El Chamisal's status. Over the following 50 years, Mexico would continuously lobby for the return of this territory, which remained under Texas and United States jurisdiction. Many U.S. presidents between 1911 and 1963 attempted to resolve the issue, but their proposals were often one-sided. Some suggested the U.S. forgive an old Mexican debt in exchange for the land. Others proposed land exchanges in different areas. One plan even suggested that Mexico simply sell El Chamisal to the United States outright. With all these offers falling short and both sides unwilling to compromise, El Chamisal seemed destined to remain in international limbo forever, a territory claimed by two nations but properly governed by neither. By the 1960s, the geopolitical landscape had shifted dramatically. The United States was locked in the Cold War with the Soviet Union, and tensions were especially high following the Cuban Missile Crisis, with Cuba now aligned with the Soviet bloc just 90 miles from Florida's coast. U.S. foreign policy focused intensely on preventing further communist influence in the Western Hemisphere. It was likely this strategic thinking that prompted President John F. Kennedy to finally end the Chamisal dispute, which had festered for nearly a century. Having a stable, friendly relationship with Mexico became a foreign policy priority. In June 1962, President Kennedy and First Lady Jackie Kennedy traveled to Mexico to personally meet with President Adolfo López Mateos. During this highly publicized visit, the Kennedys toured Mexico City, engaged with locals, and visited landmarks to strengthen international relations. But the real purpose was diplomatic, setting terms for a treaty regarding El Chamizal. The agreement was officially ratified on January 14, 1963. The treaty divided El Chamizal with 366 acres going to Mexico, along with 71 acres east of the adjacent Cordova Island. The rest would remain with the United States, and no money would be exchanged. Additionally, the new border would run between El Paso and Ciudad Juarez, with a concrete canal built to control the Rio Grande. Both countries would share the construction costs. After a century of dispute, politicians on both sides hailed the treaty as a diplomatic triumph. Kennedy secured a friendly southern neighbor during the Cold War, and Mexico reclaimed at least part of its long-disputed territory. But there was one critical element the treaty largely overlooked: the people who actually lived in El Chamizal. For as long as the debate over El Chamizal had raged, the people living there suffered to varying degrees. Locals like Del Barrio had to deal with U.S. companies taking their land. Others faced legal limbo, often excluded from legal protections and basic human rights afforded to citizens of either country. The treaty put enormous focus on land distribution and border resolution, but gave little consideration to the human element. Yet these were real communities, families who had lived in these neighborhoods for generations. When implementation began, the reality was harsh. The river was dammed in concrete, and the community was quite literally divided between two countries. In attempts to relocate buildings and businesses to their appropriate new locations, entire neighborhoods were condemned and demolished. Over 5,600 people were reportedly displaced from their homes, though many sources place that number even higher. Despite the fact that many people living in this area were war veterans who had fought for the U.S., they suddenly found themselves homeless. Some veterans even returned home from Vietnam to find their houses demolished while they were away fighting, a particularly cruel irony for those who had served the very country that now displaced them. By 1967, conditions had deteriorated so badly that Time magazine described El Chamizal communities as a thicket of slums. With neither the U.S. nor Mexican governments adequately helping the people caught in this transition, the community had to organize to help themselves. Of all the people caught in this century-long land dispute, few accomplished as much for the community as Elvira Villa Lacara Escajeda. Born in 1920 in El Chamizal, when it was U.S. territory, Elvira was deeply American. She attended local schools, and her family worshipped at the Sacred Heart Catholic Church. Her brothers served in the U.S. military during World War II and the Korean War. When the Chamizal Treaty led to the neighborhood demolitions, Elvira refused to accept this fate quietly. She founded the Chamizal Civic Association in 1963 to advocate for displaced residents and fight for adequate compensation. Despite being dismissed as a secretary by the press, a common way to minimize women's leadership, Elvira was the organization's driving force. She organized meetings, served as vice president, and personally traveled to Washington, D.C. to confront government officials. By September 1964, her impact was so significant that she received recognition from both Mexican President Mateos and U.S. President Lyndon B. Johnson, who honored her with a silver medal, a remarkable achievement for a woman challenging two powerful governments. Elvira remained active in her community until her passing in 2022, becoming a legend who represented countless individuals fighting to maintain their dignity, communities, and homes amid geopolitical forces beyond their control. The resolution of the Chamizal dispute didn't end the struggles of the affected communities. Even today, over 60 years later, this conflict's legacy shapes life along this section of the border. Organizations like La Mujer Obrera fight for women's rights in El Chamizal, while Familias Unidas del Chamisal works to improve education and public health in a community still struggling with inadequate infrastructure. If you're finding this untold story valuable, we'd love your support on our new channel. A quick like and subscribe helps us continue bringing these overlooked historical narratives to light. The concrete canal controlling the Rio Grande stands as a physical reminder of how natural geography was tamed to serve political boundaries. What was once a fluid boundary marked by a shifting river is now rigidly defined, with border walls adding another layer to this complex history of division. For families that lived through the Chamizal dispute, their experiences reveal the personal toll of geopolitics. Those who had their Mexican citizenship effectively erased by a shifting river in 1864, and those who had their American homes demolished a century later share a common experience, becoming pawns in international politics that treated them as afterthoughts. Almost every day around the world, we hear about nations changing borders, renaming bodies of water, or relocating people for various political reasons. The Chamizal dispute serves as a powerful reminder that these aren't just abstract exercises in geopolitics. They're decisions that profoundly impact real people's lives. Where most see an interesting 100-year border dispute between nations, thousands of families experience a life-altering event they had no control over, all because a river changed course and two governments couldn't agree for a century on how to handle it. Was there a better way to resolve this dispute, or was it just an unfortunate situation beyond anyone's control? The answer depends on whether you prioritize national interests or human lives, a question that remains relevant in border disputes worldwide today.